Roguelikes. You've probably heard of those before, or even have played them, but what exactly are they? You probably have a rough idea already what roguelikes are. It's games with permadeath and procedurally generated levels, right? But what about turn-based? A world represented by a grid of tiles, or ASCII graphics. To explore where those ideas about which elements are and are not part of a roguelike game come from, we'll first have to look at some history. First of all, similar to how Metroidvania has its namesake in Metroid and Castlevania, roguelikes have their namesake in the game Rogue, which was originally developed in 1980 by Michael Toy and Glenn Wichman. They used the Curses library, and later Ken Arnold, the developer of that Curses library, even joined in on the development. Rogue was freely distributed and so became immensely popular on university campuses. In 1983, it even was included in the 4.2 release of BSD, which furthered its popularity. So it comes as no surprise that there was a demand for ports for other systems. So Michael Toy, together with John Lane, founded the company AI Design and received funding from Epix to develop commercial ports for Rogue. Later, Epix also overtook the distribution and marketing of Rogue. The game itself was high fantasy inspired. Deep in the dungeons of doom, you're fighting a hungry and powerful troll for your life. You've avoided other creatures' blows before, but the troll swings and scores a hit that weakens you. Hoping to regain strength, you find and quaff a magic potion. Great Yender! It's the wrong one! The potion blinds you. But wait. Drawing an enchanted sword from your pack, you swing blindly at the troll's gold. Something hits you. A nymph steals your magic ring, a ring that could be crucial in your quest for the amulet of Yender. This is what you can read on the back of the DOS port of the game. It's quite a complex game, even if it might not seem like it just looking at it. The Dungeon of Doom that the rogue explores are tiled by ASCII symbols. The troll is a capital T, the player an @ symbol. Later versions would replace the ASCII characters with special symbols and tiles, but the gameplay would stay the same. The game is strictly turn-based, and every movement or action is a turn. It is also tile-based. The player, every monster and every item occupy exactly one tile, and resources such as food and potions have to be managed. But most importantly, the dungeons are procedurally generated and death is permanent. In 1986, the source code of Rogue was published under the BSD license, which enabled spin-offs and copycats. However, even before then, a network of copycats already started to emerge. These early spin-offs recreated Rogue with improvements and additional features that the developers wanted to see. One such early clone was Moria, released in 1983 and was based on Lord of the Rings lore. It spawned the lineage of games, which most notably contained U Moria in 1988, Engbad in 1990, Z Engbad 1999, and Tales of May Ariel in 2009. Another early clone was Hack 1982, which started out as a class project. Its namesake was its hacky development, as the source code of Rogue was not available at this point, and a hack and slash type gameplay. The development of its successor, NetHack, was coordinated over Usenet, hence NetHack. Despite the first release being in 1987, new versions of NetHack are actually still developed to this day. The development started in Reg Games Hack newsgroup, but was later continued in Reg Games Roguelike NetHack. But earlier versions of NetHack also received spin-offs themselves, such as Adam in 1994 and Linley's Dungeon Crawl, back then just known as Crawl, in 1995. Many of those games did not only receive further spin-offs, but also commercial ports to various systems, reaching as far as the Japanese game system PC-98. Since 2005, Reg Games Roguelike Development holds a yearly 7-day roguelike challenge where developers are challenged to write a new complete roguelike game in a mere 178 hours. But the important question is, who actually says what is and isn't a roguelike? How have we gotten to the definitions that we throw around these days? Well, do you remember the roguelike newsgroups? It's those people. Those 9 people on this desk. In 2008, a couple of Usenet users from the Reg Games Roguelike Development newsgroup meet up. The participants are 4 people from Germany, 3 people from Poland, 1 person from Austria, and 1 person from Canada. They vote on a time and place and decide on Berlin, and they also vote for a name on their meetup and land on the International Roguelike Development Conference IRDC 2008. Among other things, the participants develop a definition for roguelikes, which they later publish in their newsgroup. It's unclear if they know how influential this definition that they set out to make was going to be. Because this definition, the Berlin interpretation, has been since then widely used by snobs all over the internet to gatekeep what is and isn't part of their community. They used a blog article by user Slash as a starting off point for discussions. Slash did not attend the balloon convention. Slash also since then replaced this article. Slash, the creator of the blog article, is an active roguelike developer, has participated in all of the 7-day roguelike challenges, and is the creator of the Rogue Basin wiki, which was used to organize the event. They also used this article and 5 canon games: Adam, Angbat, Crawl, NetHack, and Rogue. And yes, you might be able to see some similarities here. Now let's get over the text of the Berlin Convention. They first of all mentioned the purpose of the definition is for the roguelike community to better understand what the community is studying. It is not to place constraints on developers or games, which is a nice preamble to have. We get to that later. They define a bunch of high value factors and low value factors. And it's hard to have a discussion about roguelikes without even taking note of these factors, so we'll have to get through them. There's random environment generation. The game world is randomly generated in a way that increases replayability. We have several rules of what is random and what isn't. So the appearance and placement of items is random, and the placement of monsters is random, but the appearance of monsters is fixed. You want to avoid fixed content such as plots, puzzles, or vault, because that removes randomness. Next, permadeath. This is pretty self-explanatory. You're not expected to win with your first character, and if you die, you die. You start over from the first level after death. It is turn-based, so each command corresponds to a single action or movement, and the game is not sensitive to time. It is grid-based, so the world is represented by a uniform grid of tiles, and monsters and player alike, and items and everything, take up one tile each. So you don't have bigger monsters, you don't have bigger items or anything. Everything is exactly one tile. It is non-modal, so every action should be available at any point of the game, which is already broken by some of the canon games. In Adam and Crawl, you have an overworld or shops where you can buy items only there. But the idea of non-modality is that you can do every action, such as buying items, everywhere. So this is already broken by some of the canon games, where you can already see the cracks begin to show. Now it has to be complex, so you want enough complexity to allow several solutions to common goals, and this is obtained by enough item and item monster interactions. This is strongly connected to non-modality, as if you can do every action at any point of the game, you have more complexity. You also have resource management. You have to manage limited resources. You have to find uses for the resources that you do find. You have resources like food, potions, rings. It also has to be hack and slash. So killing lots of monsters is a very important part of the roguelike. This is player versus world. You have no monster-monster relations, neither negative nor positive. You can't have monsters forming alliances. You cannot have monsters attacking each other. You just have player versus world. The next high value factor is exploration and discovery. The game requires careful exploration of the dungeon levels, and you should discover the usage of unidentified items. And this exploration and discovery has to be done anew every time you start a new game. You also have a bunch of low value factors. It has to be a single player character, so you control a single character and this game is player centric. So no multiplayer, no controlling this character and then switching over to a different character and then switching back to the first character. No, just this one single character that you control. Monsters are similar to players, so all rules that apply to the player also apply to the monsters. Monsters have inventories, can use items, can use spells. It also should apply a tactical challenge. You should learn about the tactics before the player can make any significant progress. So you shouldn't just be able to play the game once and beat it, but you should learn about the tactics. It's also required that you have an ASCII display, so the world is represented by a tiled world out of ASCII characters. As we know, every roguelike that we play these days is also just made out of an ASCII display. You also have to have dungeons. Dungeons are levels composed of rooms and corridors meant to be explored by the player. However, the phrasing is also firmly rooted in the high fantasy space. Also, another low value factor is numbers. Character hit points, attributes, and so on should be deliberately shown at all times to the player. Well, you might be thinking to yourself, wait a second, I thought I played this in that game and I thought this was a roguelike. This doesn't sound like it's a roguelike at all. It's not turn-based, it's not even using ASCII characters. To be fair, that's a low value factor, but you still get the idea. Still, many of the high value factors don't really apply to roguelikes that we know these days. You have to keep in mind when this definition was made and what the state of roguelikes looked like at the time. In the early 2000s, the relative popularity of roguelikes was at a low point, as more capable computers allowed for more visually appealing game genres such as action RPGs to flourish. This doesn't mean that the genre had no relevance. Games like Diablo certainly were influenced by it. However, the community discussing roguelikes was small. So you have more of a extremely niche fan base. I've mapped out the releases of roguelikes per year by using the mobile games API and writing a little script for it. You have a few roguelikes every year, but nothing major, especially if you think about how many other games were released around that time. Also, a short note about 1978 and 1979. You might remember Rogue was released in 1980. Rogue was actually not the first roguelike. You have the first game that actually plays like roguelikes according to the Berlin definition is Beneath Apple Manor, released in 1978. But in the late 2000s and early 2010s, another trend is emerging. Games that are not turn and grid-based RPGs, but still use element of roguelikes. In 25, Weird Worlds is released, which uses roguelike elements in a mostly strategy and simulation type game. In 2009, Spelunky, a platformer that uses roguelike elements to great success. And then in 2012, FTL, Faster Than Light, a strategy game, does it again. Spelunky and FTL were critical and commercially huge successes and inspired more to come. There's The Binding of Isaac 2011, a shooter game, Slay the Spire 2017, a deck builder, Dead Cells 2017, a Metroidvania, and Hades 2018, an action RPG. All these games have permadeath and procedurally generated content, but stray far from the Berlin interpretation. However, they kicked off a resurgence of games classified as roguelikes. This reached up to 171 releases last year, and if you count multi-platform releases separately, that's even as many as 428. However, many hardcore fans of games that fit the original definition did not like what they saw as a dilution of that term, and so alternative descriptors to these new types of games emerged, such as roguelike-likes, procedurally generated death labyrinths, and finally roguelites. They are popularly classified by swapping RPG elements with other genres elements, shorter gameplay runs with victory conditions, although you could actually beat the original Rogue, real-time elements, which according to them reduce complexity, fixed events and elements such as biomes and boss fights, and a metagame, so some persistent improvements can still be made between runs which you don't lose once you die. However, in the other camp, you have critical voices against the Berlin interpretation appearing too. What they are saying is that many gamers want to be exclusive about their community, and so the Berlin Convention is a convenient tool to use as a golden rule to gauge what a roguelike is and isn't. One popular accusation is that people who use the Berlin interpretation cherry-pick their aspects that they want to focus on, and ignore other factors that would exclude their game that they would see as a roguelike from their own definition. Darian Gray, a roguelike developer himself and critic of the Berlin interpretation, has written an article titled "Screw the Berlin Interpretation," which even made its way back to the Rogue Basin Wiki, the place which was used to organize the Berlin Convention, which birthed this definition in the first place. He writes that the factors in the Berlin interpretation range from obvious, like random content, to absolute nonsense, like the dungeon setting or ASCII, and posits that it's like saying platformers have to have pixel graphics because all of the old platformers had pixel graphics. They also criticize that the disclaimer is futile, since developers want their game to fit a definition so that people can find it and play their games. So they are, in the end, restricted by that definition, even if it wasn't the goal of the definition to restrict developers. The roguelike scene has seen many changes since 2008. The explosion of the genre happened right after 2008. So this interpretation is out of date and out of touch with modern roguelikes. You could also say that those who argue over the Berlin interpretation aren't playing enough modern roguelikes. The Berlin interpretation limits creative potential and pushes people out of the community. Descriptors like turn-based get used as clubs to beat other games out, even games that do innovative things with the time system like Faster Than Light. So what does Darian suggest we do? Is just everything a roguelike? Nothing. The article tells us that we have to think about the what versus why. Definitions address the what, but not the why. They describe what something is, not why something is how it is. A certain roguelike feel can be described but cannot be reduced to an ingredients list. We should understand the reason why those features got described in the first place. So the interpretation fixed some factors that, with their presence, a game felt like a roguelike. But we shouldn't then use those factors or those observancies and use them as ingredients to say, oh, only if you have those factors you have a roguelike. You can have a game that feels in spirit like a roguelike, but it doesn't use those factors. And you can have a game that uses all of those factors, but doesn't really feel like a roguelike. So you should understand the reasons behind those features in the Berlin interpretation, and this should enable developers to change features while keeping the spirit of a roguelike game. So, what is a roguelike to Darian? Well, while the author argues against fixed definitions, he gives some points as a more healthy way of reflecting on what makes roguelikes what they are. So, a roguelike is a game that is inherently replayable. It is capable of surprising the player in many playthroughs. It rewards cleverness and tactical thinking. It cannot simply learn by rote, but must be mastered with experience. There's emphasis on gameplay before aesthetics. It's unforgiving but more rewarding if you perform it well. This shows some shift of perspective of this author's mind. In 2008, Darren wrote in the Rec Games Roguelike newsgroup as a direct reply to the Berlin interpretation, "So, can we start a flame war now?" and expresses his surprise that elements like Tolkien D&D style fantasy or character creation are missing. But even back then he keeps a broad view and writes, "Of course, personally I'm happy to call any game roguelike if one of the major influences on its creation was roguelike or rogue itself. A member of the family by descent, as it were." So that settles it then, right? Unfortunately not. Reddit comments on the r/roguelike subreddit to his article point out that the ASCII graphics, for example, are listed as a low value criteria. You have to admit that roguelikes occupy a really narrow niche in gaming. That's why most people haven't heard of them. Your proposed definition is too loose. Even Miss Pac-Man would be argued to be a roguelike under that criteria. This whole debate about what makes roguelikes smacks of an attempt to lend old school legitimacy to a class of new games. Another commenter writes, "So from a practical point of view, what use is the term if it's so vague as to not describe anything? The Berlin interpretation is way out of date and misses a lot of subtleties. But I could easily write a similar prescriptive definition of tower defense games and it would work just fine, cause no disagreements, and would not limit developers at all. There's something different about roguelike games though. What is it?" A third commenter yearns for the day when this debate is over. And so do the moderators of the subreddit. r/roguelike subreddit banned any definition posts. Posts focused on the definition of the term roguelike will be removed. That, of course, just shifts the discussion on other platforms. Roguelike developer Josh Gay writes in an interview with PCGamer.com, "We've had a perfectly fine term for this genre for a couple of decades, and there's a certain loss of identity when a mainstream majority starts using that term to mean something rather different, and we can no longer use it to have the same meaning it once had, at least not without considering the audience." However, Jeremiah Red, another roguelike developer, argues that the definitions change and that roguelike just means something different in 2020 than it did in 1993. That a mainstream audience understands roguelikes to be games that hardcore audience would describe as roguelites, and that this confusion is causing people curious about roguelikes to be screamed out of town, or out of forums for that matter. So, where does this leave us? First of all, I think that a differentiation should be made between fans of the original roguelike games that want to use that term as they have for a long time, and nitpickers that want to actually someone talking about their favorite game without understanding the history themselves. We might want to hear the first group of people out. So, are hardcore devotees to the early definitions of the genre gatekeeping community, or are marketeers resurrecting an old term for a very specific and niche genre and misusing it to just mean difficult game? I started agreeing with Darian Gray, maybe disagreeing with the point about aesthetics, since I think aesthetics and gameplay stand in no relation to each other. However, I've come to realize that this broad definition does lose some of its original meaning. The why of the original definition was to describe games that play like the descendants of Rogue, without wanting to limit itself to pure lineage. I hate to be this guy, but I think the truth lies somewhere in the middle. Newer games that are currently broadly categorized as roguelikes have few things in common with the early rogue variants. However, they do share a unique identity between each other and thus deserve their own term. The issue is just what term to use. Procedurally generated Death Labyrinth is cumbersome and roguelites is just phonetically confusing. And if we invent a whole new word, it's likely hard to get that word out. So maybe for now we just have to live with a descriptor that, depending on context, means different things.